Carlsen. Game 6, Carlsen versus Anand. And as you can probably see immediately, I am very excited today. Some of you will suspect that's because I'm excited whenever Carlsen wins a game because I'm a fan of his. Some will suspect it's because I'm excited whenever there's a decisive result, right? I was pretty excited when Anand won Game 3. Others will know that I'm excited about 11 out of 12 games in the typical World Championship match between Anand and Carlsen. So, yeah, great day. There's a game, and very interesting game at that. Remember from games 3 and 4, the question was really on Carlsen, in my opinion, to figure out like what kind of openings he wanted to be playing, because Anand seemed to have figured out like a really good choice of openings for games 3 and 4. And then it was like, the opening really didn't work out for Carlsen 2 games in a row. Well, I feel now that we've seen games 5 and 6, Carlsen has found at least temporary solutions to his opening problems. I don't know if these are openings that he can repeat, but he at least found like good examples of opening choices for him to make against Anand. So, let me make sure this is paused. All right. He at least found good examples of openings that he can play against Anand. And, you know, he may have to move on to other ones like this, but at least it was like successful for these 2 games. And it shows at least that he knows what he needs to be doing in the opening against Anand. So against the Sicilian, he went into the open Sicilian today. And that's probably the right answer to the Sicilian. I don't know. It's what everybody else has done for 100 years. Of course, I mean, he didn't do it the way everyone else does it. He definitely played his own version of the open Sicilian. But let's go ahead and have a look at the game. So let's see. Here's my board. There we go. Clicking over here so I can also see any comments that anyone makes. So if you have any questions at any point during this video now, I should be able to directly answer your question, perhaps with a minute delay. Depending on any lag on the broadcast, but I'll certainly try to get to any questions you have today. Excuse me for that. All right, so open Sicilian. Anand plays e6 again, just like he did in game 4. So at least from that game 4, Carlsen didn't go into Anand's prep by playing an open Sicilian, but he saw, he's playing the e6 Sicilian. And when he played King's Indian, he said, okay, I know like which 2 Sicilians to mainly prepare for next game. So now he's kind of prepared probably for both knight c6 and a6. Maybe a little bit for knight f6 as well, which could go knight f6, knight c3, d6. And that would be the Scheveningen variation. So he's probably prepared for those 2. Anand goes for a6. These days, knight c6 is the most popular of the e6 Sicilians, but whatever. This one is a fun one too. And here Carlsen plays a move which I don't think should be surprising to anyone. He plays c4, going for a Rb1 type structure. And it's clear to me that Carlsen likes this structure from, looking through hundreds of his games. He likes playing, possibly either side of it, but this is definitely a structure that he likes to play with white pretty often, the c4, e4 pawns. And he gets to it from 1e4, but also from 1c4 and, some other openings. You can transpose to Rb1 structures. So not a surprise that he goes for c4 here so far. Now, all right, Anand goes knight f6, bishop to b4. And here Carlsen plays a slightly unusual move, which would normally be kind of surprising, which is developing the queen when the main move in this position is to develop the bishop to defend this pawn that black's threatening. Instead, Magnus develops his queen to defend e4, kind of blocking this piece and kind of just a little bit of a slightly clunky looking move, right? But what move does this remind us of? Well, since we all have such great memories, of course, it reminds us of what Carlsen played in game 5 last year to win the first game of the World Championship match, which was a slightly unusual queen d3 move early in the opening, which, surprise, surprise, also quickly led to a queen trade. And today's the spoiler day. I mean, I've looked at the game in advance, and I'm not preserving you from the result or the opening or the course of the game. So he's going to trade and trade queens here, just like he did in game 5 last year, out of a d4 opening. Okay, so queen d3, slightly surprising. Bishop d3 is the main move, and I had a quick look at it, and it looks like a move that could potentially have some serious opening theory involved. For example, I saw one critical line for black would be knight c6, attacking this piece. This is typical, right? White's blocked his defense of that piece, so black pressures it. And then when white trades, you get this position. Now, in this position, if black's able to play e5, they have a very beautiful structure, right? They have equal space in the middle of the board and room for all their pieces. So that being the positional threat, I think the main line here probably would be for white to prevent e5 by black and play the sort of critical looking move e5, attacking the knight. And if the knight just retreats, white's position is really good. We'll have a similar structure in our game today, so just trust me on that for the moment. White's position is pretty good if the knight retreats. So again, the key variation is going to be black going for tactics, and then white takes, black takes, white takes, black takes. The rook's hanging, so bishop d2 to defend it, then queen d3, pawn takes g7, rook g8. So a pretty simple principled forcing line after bishop d3. I mean, there are some alternatives, but this kind of a variation could very, very easily be sort of like best play for white and black coming out of that opening. And so then you get to a position like this, like almost by force, and then you run your computers on it for 10 hours. And like, you know, this variation could be very, very far prepared out by either player. Okay. And looks very complicated and concrete, right? White can't castle. This pawn could be dangerous or could be dead. Black's weak on the dark squares. White's pieces are all passive. Very, very complicated, weird position, and definitely a position where computer analysis would be pretty darn valuable. So, in other words, exactly the opposite of a Magnus variation. So, I wouldn't be surprised if Anand was going for something like that with some opening analysis done, that he could have expected c4 was a very likely variation from Magnus, c4, bishop d3. And Magnus instead plays queen d3, and in a couple moves, we get a total Magnus game instead of that variation, which was totally the opposite of Magnus. So queen d3, avoiding any really long, sharp opening variations. Knight c6 is played, and now he just trades, right? And he's basically wasted a tempo on queen d3, but gotten a Magnus position here. And also trading queens and keeping black from castling means that losing a tempo is not all important in this position, right? It's going to be a long endgame. Or, I mean, it has a great likelihood of being a long endgame. The next few moves are being kind of slow, nobody immediately attacking anything. So the lost tempo is not going to be super critical here. Now, let's see if you can apply your knowledge. What is the critical issue in the next one move for black and white? What's the key point that each of them would like to get here? Key development or key square or key concept? Like what idea governs the next move here? And you could imagine this move for this position here for white or for black. In the game, it's Carlsen's move, but you could equally well imagine this as black's move, Anand's move, and ask yourself what Anand would want to play, and then ask yourself what Carlsen would want to play. Let's actually put their names on this, shall we? So that any latecomers who don't know what's up in the chess world don't come in and think I'm playing games against myself and then analyzing them for you all. That'll be quite a sad day, huh? Whenever you tune into my channel in like 17 years or something like that, and you find me with a beard down to my table, analyzing a game that I played against myself the day before, and being like, here, I didn't know what I was planning. but I figured I needed to prevent my plan. And then you'll know it's over for me. Anyway, did anyone figure this out? The key issue is e5. Okay, if black is able to play e5, they kind of equalize space and get a good pawn structure where e5 gives them space and c6 covers this weakness. White has a little bit more space, but d4 is weak, and they might rather have one of these pawns one square back. So if it were black's move, they would definitely play e5, which would be really good for them. If it's white's move, they definitely want to play e5 themselves, or some move that stops e5 from black, but e5 is the easiest one. Now, I mean, tactically speaking, I guess that's the key strategic point, and some of you might have been distracted by an important tactical point, and I wouldn't score you off, take points off your marks if I were grading you for this, noticing that e4 is hanging and the black's threatening to just eat a center pawn. Okay, that is obviously critical tactically. Strategically, white's goal would be to prevent black from playing e5, right? So if you just played like, oh, my pawn's attacked, I'll develop a piece and defend it. Simple move, right? And then black plays e5. This position's not good for white at all. Like, at all. Probably white's a little bit worse immediately, but I could be overstating it or misestimating it. Anyway, the critical move for white has to be that they can play e5. And I'm going to guess that even though Magnus doesn't like long forced variations, I'm going to guess that he must have looked at this move in advance and known that it was sound. Anand retreats with knight to d7, but one of the critical questions with e5 is what if Anand played knight e4 going after this, right? It seems to win a pawn, and if white plays bishop d2, then it's black who comes out with the bishop pair. If they just trade on d2 and retreat their bishop, black would be somewhat okay there. And another option would be to trade here and trade both the knight and bishop and still leave white with these doubled pawns. And then, I don't know, maybe c5 to get a diagonal for the bishop. I haven't analyzed this endgame out. I just assumed that it wasn't good for white. That could be wrong, but my just sort of guess evaluation here is that black's doing perfectly fine. So on knight e4, I guess Carlsen must have had planned this concrete move a3 and probably prepared it before the game. So threatening the bishop forces black to take with the bishop first. Pawn takes. And now if the knight takes to go ahead a pawn, it looks like Carlsen can probably trap this knight. So right now its escape square would be here, so maybe a4. And then if it goes here, bishop e3 cuts off these squares. And you're threatening f3 or bishop d3. And I think that black is actually like busted here. They play h6. You can cut them off with h4. Now you're not threatening f3, but you're still threatening bishop d3. Yeah. I mean, there's also multiple ways white could even get compensation if they couldn't trap the knight. Like, for example, if I play f3, knight to this square where it can't do anything anymore, right? Then check him here. Here. And here. Right? This is also like a tough position for black, even though white is simply down a pawn. It's going to take white a while to get this rook to the d file, but when they do, they're basically going to be instantly winning the game. So black better somehow be ready for that. Various moves possible. I don't know exactly what he would go for. He could go here and here. He could go rook h2 and over here. He could play just king f2, preparing to do this and double. So anyway, it looks like very bad for black to go for that. So in the game, Anand just retreated his knight to d7, putting some pressure on this pawn, and Carlsen defends it with his bishop. So f4. Hard to see. Okay, so we've got one comment in the chat. Hard to see Anand winning after this terrible miss. I don't know what Anand's terrible miss was this game. I think he got outplayed and beat pretty soundly, like in game 2. And as we know, after getting beat soundly in game 2, he came back and won the very next game very soundly himself. So, yeah, I mean, before this match, a very strong grandmaster told me that he thought whoever won the first game would definitely win the first match. So there was like, would definitely win the whole match because there's like very hard to come back. And indeed, it is really hard to come back in a relatively short 12-game match from losing a game against, a 2,800 level opponent who knows that if they draw every game, they win the match. It's very hard to come back from being down a game. I agree. But I don't think that the match is over at this point. I think that the openings that Carlsen chose in games 5 and 6 were kind of stopgaps and not necessarily an opening that he can return to. I think that Anand has shown that he can win a game. He's shown that he can win a game after losing a game. And so overall, I think, even though Carlsen's also still probably the better player based on rating, as I always say, the odds of Carlsen winning the match are definitely higher than 50%. But I don't know that, Carlsen winning a game is going to finish the match right here. So this is game 6. There are 6 more games to go. Next game, they switch who has white first. So in other words, next game, Carlsen gets white again, 2 whites in a row. But Anand still has 3 whites of his own this match. So I would say the match isn't over yet, and Anand has gotten a better position with white every game so far this match. 3 games out of 3. So he certainly still has some chances in the match. That's just my opinion. I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm just trying to give my feeling on what you're asking about. Okay. So, I was just going to say playing f4 is bad here because it blocks your own dark squared bishop. Bad, I mean, it's like undesirable. Okay, so someone's referring to the tactical blunder on move 26, which we'll get to, and which I have a very different perspective on than other people. So we'll get there. We'll get there in a bit. But yeah, there is like a tactic that Anand and Carlsen both miss on one move that could have turned around the evaluation of the position. This video was supposed to be called Carlsen-Anand Game 6, and I wrote it as Anand-Carlsen Game 6. Good point. Can I edit it while we're live to change the name of this video? Looks like maybe I can. We'll see if that works. Sorry for the confusion there. That was dumb. I've tried to switch the naming each time to show who's white in the video names. Okay, let's see. So, so hopefully everyone understands why it's desirable rather to have your, whoops, that's not how your bishops move, is it? Why it's desirable to have your bishop out here rather than your pawn. If there's any confusion about that, we can talk about that more later. Here, Anand makes a very committal decision to give Carlsen doubled pawns and give Carlsen the bishop pair. He could also keep this piece, right, on like e7 or something like that and just hunker down with a space disadvantage. Personally, I have no idea which would be better. I tend to like the bishop pair, and I don't see in this game Anand ever putting any serious pressure against Carlsen's weakened pawns. So if I had to guess, but this is basically not much better than a guess. If I had to guess, it might have been slightly better not to trade on c3 and to keep this bishop. Another reason I would make that guess is that in the game, Anand is like in huge trouble, and so far, it doesn't look like he's played any bad moves. So at some point here, he must have played a move that wasn't like the best choice. And this is a thing with Carlsen games, is it's often very, very difficult to say where his opponent went wrong and where his advantage grew from like minute to a little bit less minute to fairly noticeable to really annoying, and then they lose. And, strong grandmasters all over the world, hundreds of them, are like poring over his game after it's played, trying to figure out where exactly did, his opponent get into trouble and where was the last chance to draw this endgame. But it is so hard to figure it out. And I'm just going to put out my own little guess here that this bishop takes c3 check is one of those decisions that, surrenders a tenth of a pawn or something like that, right? Like, positionally. Some of you probably use computers a lot more than I do. So in computer engine speak, 0.1 or something like that, right? Like if you retreat the bishop, it might be a 0.2 advantage for white. And if you take on c3, it might be a 0.3 advantage. Not that you have to retreat right away. You can also just leave the tension here and just play king c7, right? I would never retreat until you played a3 or did something. Anyway, this might be a slightly bad decision by Anand to give up the bishop pair here. Partly because, as we see, he's never going to make any real counterplay with the bad pawns he gives Carlsen on the queen side. So what he's traded is the bishop pair for this disadvantage. And then if he never really makes much use of it, then it maybe wasn't a worthwhile trade, right? Okay. So maybe a slight error there. And now he continues developing. And this is my other moment. So these moves are really, really early on. So it could seem a little bit weird. But in this position, he plays king c7, and eventually his kingside comes under pressure. And it's not just an accident that it's eventually his kingside that comes under pressure. Carlsen already has a space advantage that's a little bit more on the kingside, right? And Carlsen has doubled pawns on the queen side, which actually makes his position less flexible on the queen side. It's harder for him to attack. He does have a semi-open file, but that just gives him one target. He has no ways to open more room, no ways to open diagonals. So if you look at this position here, the most likely place, I would guess, for white to try to make progress in this endgame, to try and eventually attack, and I mean positionally attack, right? The most likely place for white to attack positionally, I think, is the king side at this point. And therefore, I suspect that king e7 is an important alternative for Anand in this position. Just so his king is closer to the pawns that Carlsen's a little bit more likely to attack. Now, at some point, Carlsen could either play bishop g5 or bishop c1, bishop a3 to assault this king position. And the king's not very flexible here. If it ever goes back to the back rank, you destroy the coordination of your rooks. So what's the plan for dealing with that? Well, my thought is that if the bishop came to a3, worst case scenario, you could play pawn to c5, which is not a terrible move for black. In some cases, if you already played b6, you could maybe play knight c5, but that would be risky for your b pawn after rook b1. But I think bishop a3, you can probably shut out with c5. And bishop g5, you can probably just be willing to play f6 and split your kingside pawns. But the thing is, you're just sort of gaining control of some dark squares by playing f6. And the dark squares are what you need to control because you've got a light squared bishop and no dark squared bishop. So I think breaking with f6 and then maybe getting control of e5 and just trying to develop your pieces. And yes, you get split pawns on the king side, but your opponent has some bad pawns too. And at least you get room and space for your pieces and can work on starting to find an outpost in the center for your knight. Or not necessarily an outpost, but like a good square or two for your knight in the center. Because remember, when fighting the bishop pair, your number one priority is a good square for your knight. A good square that they can't just chase it away with a pawn. A square from which your knight can get to work. Okay? Given the course of the game, it's quite conceivable that this move king to c7 by Anand was, along with bishop c3, that these were maybe some of the main culprits for him having a hard time this game. Okay? It's much more subtle than the tactical blunder on move 26 that everybody's or that several people are talking about, but I think it's much more important. Because this is what puts him into a position where if nothing special happens, he's going to suffer for a long, long time getting tortured by Carlsen. All right, so after king c7, Carlsen immediately plays h4, which I think is correct, since obviously I also think this is the area of the board where he's most likely to attack. Seeing how the game plays out, I feel reinforced in that notion that this is the right way to play. The idea is to gain space with this pawn. The second idea is to activate the rook by moving the pawn that's in front of it. Since, okay, his options for the rooks. he could try and pile up on the b file, while black can just play b6, and he can never break through b6 himself, so his rooks will be wasted. He could pile up on the d file. That's the other one that's interesting. You can't penetrate to d7 ever, because it's pretty well defended easily. But if you pile up your rooks on the d file, you can maybe paralyze black a little bit. So that's a secondary idea that can be used. But I would say that trying to use the rooks on the king side by lifting them to the 3rd or 4th rank and attacking the g and f pawns is possibly the most interesting here. And it's what you see in a lot of French defenses also, right? Let me just, for argument's sake, call up a random position for you all. So, you know, some kind of a mainline French defense. Right? So you've got the pawn on e5 giving you a space advantage over here. Right? And what do we see white often doing in order to try and create a weakness or create some action or get another concession out of black? What we see them doing is trying to attack these pawns, right? So there's one variation with queen g4, just attacking it directly. Another variation goes h4 here, right? And then knight c6, h5. Similar to the other game, aiming for h6 to weaken the structure here. Black plays h6 himself. You can even play rook h4, rook g4, or queen g4. Okay, very, very similar, I think. So pawn structure here, similar with the e5 versus e6. Black also, like in the winner, has traded his dark squared bishop to make a weakness on the queen side. And when I was playing through this game, it felt a lot like a winner to me, even though this pawn would be here and this pawn would be here, right? But in terms of the plan that Carlsen uses and the way he puts pressure on Anand, a lot of the maneuvers were maneuvers which I've seen in the winner French defense before, instead of in the Sicilian. And it comes from having that space with the e5 pawn and having the bishop pair, I think. So he goes for space on the king side, b6, h5. So h6 is a little bit of an extra positional threat because of weakening the dark squares. Okay, so that's a factor of black having bishop and knight versus bishop pair. You look which bishop black doesn't have. It's the dark squared bishop. Those are the squares that black's likely to become positionally weak on. So one thing that you like to do is you like to trade off or make move their last pawn on a dark square. It gives you access to more control of those dark squares. As you get control of the dark squares, it makes it really hard for your opponent to then ever regain control of them, right? Like, for example, remember that variation with bishop g5 check f6 that I just showed? I don't want to go into this too exhaustively, but where is it? Here. King e7, bishop g5, f6. So the g pawn is what allows you to play f6. f6 allows you to maybe get control of e5 and maybe play e5. So having control of a dark square is kind of a prerequisite for gaining control of another dark square and then gaining control of another dark square. So the plan that you're seeing Carlsen threaten here with h6 is to get this pawn off of a dark square. Then black will have greater and greater difficulty ever trying to regain control of any of the dark squares. Okay, and that's why when a pawn comes to h5 in these winner structures, you almost always see the black players play h6 to prevent white from playing h6. Because they know that once this pawn gets to h6, whether they trade or play g6, either way, they're not ever going to get control of these dark squares again. They're basically like nigh impossible. It does keep the king side closed, so it's not yet clear where Carlsen's going to put his pressure, but it leaves black so weak on those dark squares, right? So he can put a rook here to attack this, or double rooks on the d file, and then at some point play bishop g5 to take control of d8 and bishop e7, because black won't be able to block with f6. There's just so many bad things that black has no control over anymore once he loses the last dark square there. So if you're interested in that and you're a chess.com user, I created a whole chess mentor lesson about color complex weaknesses, because I know that's something which a lot of amateur players don't fully understand, why like a GM is looking at some position, they're like, and here the light squares are weak. And you're like, so what does that mean? Anyway, if you're interested in the subject, there's a whole series I made that you could look at that hopefully explains it pretty clearly. For now, Anand plays h6 to prevent that. And now Carlsen puts his plan into motion. And by the way, I mean, he could have played almost the same plan with rook d1 instead of castling, as far as I could tell. Bishop b7, rook d3. So this is the plan, right? This pawn gaining space has kind of made black clarify his kingside pawn structure a little bit, right? He played h6, not f6, not g6 for now, right? Clarified a little bit, and now he's going to come and he's going to attack the pawns on the third rank. And he can also use this one if he wants. So now there's about to be a lot of pressure on these pawns. I think black is definitely struggling pretty badly here. And, you know, this will start to beg the question of whether you might want your king to be over there to defend those pawns. Black still doesn't show any way of attacking these pawns for the moment. There's no open file to get at them. And he just doesn't have that many active pieces. He goes for b6 and c5 to at least have this bishop on a nice long open diagonal, just so that he's in better position to, you know, defend himself and fight. And I think that's about as good as he could do with the queen side. I don't think playing a move like b5 to try and target these pawns is going to help him. Like, you might say it's creating counterplay away from the king side, but white hasn't really committed his pieces to the king side yet. And what white can do is say, okay, we'll trade pawns on the queen side. I have the bishop pair and your king is there and my rooks are more active. So white can still play both sides of the board, no problem at all. He's not yet committed where if like anything opened on the queen side, he would be caught flat-footed there. Okay, so c5, rook g3, rook a g8. If the other rook comes here, it seems weird to trap that rook in, right? But if the other rook comes here, Carlsen plays the same move he played in the game, bishop d3. And now he's just threatening bishop h7, rook h8, rook takes g7, just winning that pawn, right? Well, there's basically no way to prevent this. Knight f8 to stop knight h7, I believe allows bishop takes h6. Because pawn takes, you lose this. And so black's lost a pawn and they're still under huge pressure on the king side. So that's why he moves this rook over. And Carlsen develops this bishop, which may not even be necessary, by the way. Might not even need to. And yeah. So now this is kind of like a critical position. To me, it's like important to understand how good or bad is this position for black. Well, I mean, it's obviously not good, right? How bad is this position for black? How much pressure is black under if they do nothing? And then what are black's alternative plans here? In the game, Anand goes for knight f8 and then g6. Okay, trying to like break, right? Not willing to just suffer with his rooks having one square for the entire game. So he goes to break. Other plans here, the two major plans, I think, and you can try and guess these in your head. What are the two major ways for black to play this position other than breaking with g6? So to me, one option always when you're on the defensive and worse is to just sit. Let the opponent prove that they can actually like crack through before you like move any pawns and create any new weaknesses, okay? Because any pawn move you make is going to have a new weakness. What does g6 weaken? Ding, 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 right? What does f6 weaken? Ding, 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 ding. Both of these, right? Because when white trades, this pawn will be undefended, and this pawn could also in some case be undefended compared to this. So any kind of plan that you do is going to create some extra weakness. Well, it might be uncomfortable to sit here, but if white has no way to break through, then you don't necessarily need to break through. So, for example, black could try, if he wanted to sit tight, he could try to just bring his king to f8 and just defend this. It's not pretty, but it can be done. His second plan, other than just sitting tight and defending g7, is to break with f6 at some point. Or f5, similar, right? And allow white the opportunity of trading on f6. But again, to gain some more space, possibly win control of e5, something like that. So those are black's plans here. Let's see, knight f8, bishop e3, and here I looked at the f5 plan. And what was this plan? Oh, yeah. This was if... okay. So one thing was I just wanted to show what would happen if black just sits around. So just moving happens is that white just attacks g7. So the complete sit around and do nothing plan, white does have a plan to eventually just win like this. And in another variation, I pointed out that that if black ever takes on e5, white can just play bishop f4, and black's all tied up, and then go take on g7 by force. And for example, this is basically a winning position for white because this can never move again. Another option was for black to play f6 so that the king wouldn't be trapped in that bad situation with the knight, and then you trade once and win g7. And after you win g7, black's got these 3 horrible pawns to worry about, and I'm pretty sure white will win this endgame. So that is, if black sits around, white can just build up on g7. Knight e5 can always be answered by bishop f4, actually, in this case, and black doesn't make it in time. So king d8, bishop f4, king e7. So this variation here, on the other hand, this is quite hard for white to break through if the king comes all the way over to f8. I stared at this position for a while, and I did not see any winning plan for white here. Right? I looked at this for a while. You can look at it yourselves too, but I didn't see any easy breakthroughs. One reason is that f3 is kind of like lodged these rooks stuck over here, right? There's not a lot of mobility for these 3 pieces suddenly. So you've tied your opponent up so badly, but you're not in a good position to play rook a3 and try and make a new weakness over here quickly. You see how that's sort of like a problem? You're not in a good position to suddenly double rooks on the f file and attack f7 instead of g7. Things have gotten kind of bottled up. And then I blamed that on the move f3, this one here. And I realized that was not a necessary move. And so I switched from f3 to rook h4. And now after rook h4, well, black simply can't get over to defend g7 fast enough, honestly. The idea of f3 was so this pawn would be defended in case black breaks with g6. So there's not as much counterplay here. But you don't need to commit to that as soon. So it's a bad move until you have to play it, I think. And this keeps the rooks more active. And then from here, white was winning. The black king couldn't get over there in time. So it looks like here, I also have an example of the f5 move trying to break out. So let's switch over to that plan. What can white do, or how defensible would Anand's position have been if he tried to break with f5 or f6 instead of with g6? The reason I play f5 instead of f6 is if I play f6, Carlsen can probably just ignore me, right? Just keep going with this plan. Taking on e5 is not going to be that great, right? Right, the rook breaks in. These are weak. This is weak. He's got his bishop pair. Black's pieces are passive. So I played f5 to gain the space and prevent rook g4. So now we're going to see what happens if Carlsen actually trades, right? He trades. Now we've got this new structure, right? Black's going to get control of some dark squares, right? His knight could get good. His bishop is good, right? But there is one major weakness to be dealt with. And there's a second factor, which is that after this move, Carlsen gets control of the G file, which is now an open file, right? So we get to this position. Now, even though these pawns have some flexibility, black still has like somewhat weak with these pawns, however he sets them up. And this rook is hyperactive compared to the black pieces, right? So, I mean, this piece is like basically trapped. This piece is almost trapped. If it moves away, then a move like rook g6 will win h6, and this pawn becomes a strong passed pawn. So this position here is actually super miserable for black. One idea white could use to make progress would be rook f7, rook f7, rook g7, rook g7, rook f7, attacking this, right? Forcing something to move. If this pawn ever moves, this bishop can take over the diagonal at f4. If this pawn ever moves, then white definitely wants to attack that one from behind. And he can also play bishop f5 in some case. So whatever black does here, he's going to be under like extreme pressure on the king side, and I think he's nearly losing. All right, so that is the third plan, I think. What else do I have here? I've got a variation with g6, but that's kind of like the game probably, if not the actual game. Did I get back to the game here? Yep, that's the game. All right. So that's the plan chosen in the game. So does anybody, before we go on, have any questions about black's alternative plans to this committal g6 that Anand played here? Any other suggestions on how Anand should have played this position here instead of g6? Right? I think I showed that f6 is not very promising for black. Obviously, first you have to move the king or this knight f8, which made him retreat. The reason that it made him retreat is that he wanted to be able to answer h-jick. He wanted to be able to answer g6 by taking it, and then when the knight takes, it would attack these two pieces, and he wants his bishop to already be out of the way, right? So in the game, bishop e3, g6 takes. He can defend the pawn like this because he doesn't have to worry about the attack on his bishop on f4. That's why he played bishop e3 on knight f8. But does anyone have any questions about what else black could have done here instead of g6, or how f6 would play out, or if they could just sit around like this? So if I don't play f3 and black just sits around, we get this position. In this position, white is a little bit more poised to switch over, right, without the pawn on f3. So here you're maybe threatening bishop a4, taking away, forcing this knight to like b8 or something, right, taking away squares from black. So bishop c6 to prevent that. And now maybe switch to rook d3. And suddenly black's pieces are bottled up and white's able to switch areas of the board. So now I'm just coming in with rook d6, which can't really be stopped. The black pieces can't transfer over here as fast. They're still also defending against this. So you get him to play this move too. And then, I mean, just for example, suddenly this rook on g3 is on b6, right? And things are dropping. And that's all because of that stupid f3 move I'd played in my first variation, right? Allowed black to transfer the king all the way over here. So anyway, so we see how the key is to be able to have your pieces be a little bit more flexible than the opponent, so that if they bottle up here, you can switch to some other part of the board and attack it. Not playing h7, h6 at all. Well, I think I addressed that a little bit earlier. Maybe you weren't here for the first like couple minutes of the video, and you can check that later on the recording. I talked about why, in general, black wouldn't allow white to play h6. But I'm saying once we get to the position we have here, where Anand chooses to go for the g6 break, what other defensive plans are there for dealing with Carlsen's plan of going rook g4? Frankly, I don't see any good ones already here. And so Anand's position looks quite bad to me at this point. And then we ask ourselves, well, how did it get so bad so fast, right? And what I would come back to is maybe the giving up of the bishop pair, and maybe sending the king to the queen side instead of the king side from the beginning. And maybe if he'd put his king on the king side from the very beginning, he could have played a move like f6, challenging white's space advantage sooner, maybe like a whole different plan with that. Okay. All right, so I'm going to continue on and show how the game goes from here. So bishop d3, knight f8 was played, bishop e3, and now he went for g6. Okay, So once he plays g6, why is his position bad? Well, because this pawn here is now going to be super weak. As well as the fact he still has less space on the king side and he's struggling against the bishop pair a little bit. So Carlsen just trades once and he took with his knight. The reason he didn't take with the f pawn is because it drops this pawn immediately. Rook takes, bishop takes. And Anand has no counterplay here, even though he's down a pawn. In fact, he's got less than counterplay because this pawn is gone, right? So for example, rook h8. White can even just trade on f8. Bishop g7 was pointless, sorry. And then play f3, locking out that counterplay and that counterplay. And this pawn is just gone, right? Next move, we play rook g6. 2 extra pawns, and we're still targeting this one. So this is for sure a winning endgame for white. So instead, Anand takes with the knight, but now this is obviously a significant target for the foreseeable future. So rook h5, that's his other way of defending this pawn. Let's see, why again was there no rook takes h6? I'm not sure. Let's see if I can quickly figure it out again, huh? Yes. Right. So if the king were on e7 instead, would that not make a very weak b file? It's a very good question. I tried to address that a little bit in an earlier comment, but it's a very, very good question. If the king is in the center, basically this knight can almost single-handedly block the whole b file. And that's why when I discussed what plan Carlsen went for, the reason why he went for h5 and like rook over here and pressure on the king side largely was that the b file is not even that promising a file to attack. Like one knight defending the pawn on b6 can pretty much block, 2 rooks on that file. So it's just not like an easy way for white to take action. And that's partly because I was saying the doubled pawns give white the open file, but they also make white not very mobile here. So white doesn't really have good levers for opening new files or opening new diagonals for his bishop on the queen side, right? He's kind of static versus dynamic since his pawn structure isn't mobile. And so it's like a harder area for white to make progress. Therefore, if white's best plan is probably to attack on the king side, maybe instead of having our king on the queen side, we should have our king more near the king side / center from the very beginning. That was sort of the overarching point there that I was hoping to make with that. Okay, so here, why not just take the pawn right away? Let's see. I don't remember at all what's wrong with this, if anything. If knight e5, bishop f4, looks like it probably works out for white, right? Like here, you take with check, and then you take here, you're up a piece. Here, you take with check, and then you take here, and you're up a piece. So knight e5 loses to bishop f4, I think. Or can he just play here and try and struggle on? Let's see. Maybe this move. This looks very, very risky for black, this king d6, but I'm just checking. If rook e3, then I think this move saves black, trading here. If he takes here, then he won't get his rook back. And if he takes here, black has time to play, rook g2 and f6. Okay, so I think the key, if white wants to win here, is to prevent f6 from black. So keep this rook. Now, take. Black might be able to defend this one. There's no obvious way that white's about to win. I mean, they want to take on f7. you could possibly defend it. You could take this pawn. You could go for counterplay down here. You can also play the move rook to g8, which defends rook f7 because of rook takes g3, right? Like this. Rook f7, rook g3, rook b7. I don't even know if it works. Black's worse, but I feel like they might have some chance of saving that one. The other option is to trade. And then what? Rook h8. But this looks like really, really dangerous for black, right? They can either take and play 2 pawns down with the opposite colored bishops, or they can take here and they still are about 2 pawns down with same colored bishops. Yeah. Huh. I'm guessing he didn't go for this actually because of the knight e5 move. It just trades off some pawns early without immediately winning, even though it's still very, very promising advantage for white. I think Magnus probably considered himself like borderline winning here, and so he's just not even going for an option where there's any kind of possibility for black to save it. Just plays rook h5 defending this, and he's basically considering that this pawn is dead eventually whenever he wants it. Which is almost, I mean, I'm sure he knows it more specifically than that. That's an almost true idea. This pawn, what we can say for it is that it's long-term completely indefensible. There's no way black can defend the pawn against bishop and 2 rooks. Right? So there's no way he can eventually defend it. But what he can do is he can set up things where anytime you try to take it, either your e5 pawn or your g2 pawn is undefended at the end. So that's how black can make it so that white doesn't win the pawn scot-free at some point. But it's pretty tough for black. I mean, it's very, very close to a losing position that he's got. So Carlsen just defends this pawn, blockades this pawn so it can't move. If it could get to h4, then black would have more space, more counterplay against g2. Different story. So as soon as g6 is played, he isolates the pawn, blockades it, defends e5. Horrible position for black. And now he's just waiting for a moment, not doing very much. And finally, this move actually means something. The last 2 moves don't really mean much. And the rook's slightly better on g4 than on g3 if white plays f3. And white will play f3 now because it'll block this bishop out. And there's no longer any reason not to because black's already made a commitment on the king side, so white doesn't need to be able to switch sides of the board anymore. This is enough of a weakness to win the whole game based on this one weakness. Okay? When there's something this bad, you don't need any principle of 2 weaknesses. You've got a weakness you can just take eventually, right? It's like if you have a pawn on f6 and a queen on h6 and your opponent's king on g8, they might only have one weakness on g7, but it's enough to win the game. So here, this one weakness is enough to win the game. So he doesn't mind playing f3 and keeping his rooks from transferring it smoothly. So rook g4 is a slight improvement. But a5, what's the point of a5? This is actually Anand finding a very good and desperate source of counterplay. Well, he's in a desperate situation, and the fact that he finds this counterplay is very good. The idea is this: to advance the pawn all the way to a3. Then the pawn is close to queening. Very close to queening. There is an obstacle standing in its way, but it gets very, very close to queening. And that gives black various different kinds of counterplays, like things where white could win 3 pawns on the king side, but black counterattacks and wins 1 pawn on the queen side, and then black might win. And we're going to see examples of it in the analysis later on in this game. So you'll see how good a counterplay that is. If white tries to stop black by playing a4, then black has a target that white has to defend. Anytime white uses bishop takes g6, he'll lose the pawn on a4. And he can't maneuver this bishop as freely because he has to keep it defended. So I think the best place to stop this pawn is when black plays a4 for white to play a3. I think that's white's best option for slowing down the counterplay on the queen side. But the idea is that anything that white moves here increases, and the further this pawn is towards queening, increases black's chances to swindle some kind of draw when white finally opens the game up on the king side, winning a pawn, for black to try and counterattack something. And we'll see this all with variations soon enough. So they sit around for a move. And then here's the blunder that everyone's talking about. So now we get to cover this real quick. So king d2, it's a tactical blunder. I think what Carlsen ideally plays in this position is f3, blunting the bishop and making his rook on g4 defended, which reduces bad tactics against it. Then bring the king to e2 or something, and then take on h6. But with king to d2, he allows a tactic. So Anand for one move could play knight takes e5, defended by this, but this piece is attacked, right? So you can't play rook takes, well, sorry, you can't play rook takes e5 because of rook takes g4. And if you trade here, they don't take back losing the piece, but they now play knight c4 check, attacking the king. And for example, king here, knight check, king has to move somewhere, rook takes. So black wins these pawns for free, and breaks out with all his pieces. And now basically white really, really struggles to draw. They can win back this pawn, but black's left with a healthy 5 pawns against 4 pawns. Very, very good chances for black to win out of nowhere. So I think a lot of people are overly focused on this blunder and saying like, oh, you know, Anand missed this like tactical chance with knight e5. Now he's going to be so upset with himself for missing it. Well, they each missed it. And I believe that this is what happens in chess games all the time. You have mutual moments of blindness. One player doesn't notice an opportunity for some reason, and the other player doesn't notice it either for similar reasons. To me, it doesn't change the course of the game. Okay? Like, to me, Anand didn't lose the game by missing knight takes e5 here. I mean, in a sense, knight e5 is definitely an opportunity, but he and Carlsen missed the same amount of things here. They each missed this knight e5 opportunity. They weren't looking for it. They thought black was tied up, and they were careless for a moment about tactics. Okay? But the way Anand lost the game is that in this position here, he's basically in a strategically losing position, right? Carlsen took him into an endgame, increased his advantage, and eventually sort of strategically beat him here. So to me, you know, if Carlsen doesn't play king d2 and plays f3, then the game would look exactly the same as it does in the game, basically, right? And Carlsen would win the game pretty much as we saw him win it in the game after they both missed knight e5. The structure of the game still seems like adequate and correct to me. It's still how you would expect the course of the game to go. And the lesson Anand should take from this is not like, oh my God, I missed knight e5. How could I could have won the match. The lesson to take from this game is like Carlsen gave him serious problems from the opening. Straight through the endgame, he just got beat like very, very directly, and he needs another way to defend against this opening variation. Or, you know, he needs to be able to play the endgame a little bit better, because this is where Carlsen is getting him. Either avoid variations that go to this kind of endgame or play this kind of endgame better. I would suggest avoiding it, because Anand tried to gain confidence in the match last year by purposely going for one of these endgames to prove to himself that he could draw them, and then he lost it, and that's when he lost confidence and lost the match. So I think that he should actually try to avoid these kind of variations with a quick endgame with lots of tension in it, where Carlsen can outplay him. And to me, I mean, I've had like tons of games with moments like this, and I never like afterwards think that changes sort of what the strategic current of the game was. You know, and if my opponent and I each miss it, it's an equal amount of missing things, and the player who played the game better won, and that's the player, you know, who had the positional advantage before the blunder and after the blunder. So that's my take on it. These kind of blunders happen all the time, and I think people analyzing, like when people are watching these World Championship games, they often have their engines running. So as soon as Carlsen plays king d2, you know, Fritz or Shredder or Houdini or Komodo or whatever immediately goes, oh, knight takes e5 minus 1.37. Like, oh my gosh. And every, player in the world is gasping and groaning about the blunder. But, if you're not using computers, this kind of thing happens all the time. The first time I played through the game, I didn't even notice knight takes e5 when I played through it quickly. And then later, when I was playing through it more slowly, I was like, whoa. So I think this kind of thing happens all the time, and very often a mutual blunder because each player has the same attitude about what's going on in the game, and they're both not looking for this move. So I don't think that too much should be made of these kind of blunders. I think they're natural. I think they're in almost all games. There's these kind of blunders back and forth. In World Championship games, they're rarer, but they still happen. So that's my take on it. I don't think that this is at all decisive or at all an interesting or important moment in the match to me. It's like nearly meaningless to me, this blunder back and forth. In my head, I just equally well imagine, what if he'd played King D1, King E2, or what if he'd played F3 and the game would go exactly the same. So that said, let's see how the game went. A4 is played by Anand, and he's actually slightly lucky that this is the move he played on the move where they both missed 95, because then they suddenly realized 95. And so in this position, Carlsen can't play A3 to stop A3 because Anand will play 95 on the next move. You both sort of like realize these things at the same moment. It's a very funny phenomenon and feeling. So he plays King E2, getting out of the check. And that gives Anand the chance to get his pawn all the way to A3, which is really, really serious achievement for Black and counterplay. So slightly unfortunate for Carlsen, exactly where this mistake happened. Yes, in general, if you've got a higher rated player playing against a lower rated player, it's more likely the lower rated player will miss like a knight takes e5 blunder because of respect. Yeah, I mean, they don't expect the other player to make a blunder. They expect the other player to torture them. So, your mind sees what it expects to see, right? Whether it be politics or economics or chess variations. So you expect the guy's torturing. You don't expect he's blundering pawns. You don't even look at variations where you try to capture his pawns. Those variations are trimmed from your consideration by your subconscious, which doesn't expect that. And so you're only looking at various suffering moves, right? Like rook g7, rook h7, how long can I defend, and stuff like that. Definitely the case. All right, so now he puts the pawn in f3, blocking this a little bit. Rook to d8. All right, and here king to e1 was played, and there's this like sequence that they delay a little bit before Carlsen takes this, and I wanted to take this as an opportunity to again look at a variation or two and say, what happens if Carlsen tries to, start harvesting these pawns? So you don't want to harvest this pawn first with rook h6 because they take. Now your rook's not defending this, and Black takes on e5. And to be able to play knight e5 is one of the reasons why Anand is sheltering his king on b7 instead of c7 now, by the way. And again, Black's chances of drawing just improved a lot because you traded off his greatest weakness. Okay, but the real variation is bishop takes g6. Takes. Whoops. What happened? Oh, bishop takes g6. Takes. Rook takes g6. So white wins a pawn, and these things look pretty dead and juicy. And so it's a pretty good question. Like, what was Carlsen waiting for before going for this? What did he want to set up first? Well, for one thing, it commits to opposite colored bishops. So he has to be careful about what he does. And just before recording the video, I looked online and I saw someone claim that they thought Black could maybe get a draw just off opposite colored bishops by playing bishop e8. It forces this check because both rooks are attacked. I just saw rook g7 check and thought, okay, and white wins probably here. But the point is Black forces one more rook off the board. And then like here. And they were saying that just off opposite colored bishops, Black might be able to draw this endgame here. Yeah, that does seem just just barely possible. Definitely something you would want to calculate carefully as white before you go for winning this pawn. But I think the real issue going on here is the counterplay, not the opposite colored bishops. I think the issue is that black could go for counterplay with the move bishop to a4. And just getting the bishop involved. I mean, b5 might also be a good move, also trying to break open these diagonals. But I think really like telling of what's going on here is a variation like this. Bishop e4, here, here. So I don't know, something, I guess I didn't complete this variation. Maybe this wasn't a good one to use as an example. But the idea is you could lose, 3 pawns on this side of the board, but black gets so much counterplay off of this pawn. Yeah, so you see here that white is possibly even in trouble, or I guess they could now play this move, rook a8. Yeah, this is still going to cost white, right? Still going to cost white pretty seriously. Like probably his bishop. White might still be able to draw after losing his bishop for the a pawn, but it's obvious that black got a lot of counterplay there. I have another move here, different variation. Takes, rook d1, right? And rook a1. Counterplay against that pawn. I didn't go for bishop to b3, but you should always be aware of this move. Bishop b3, pawn takes a2, because here white has rook h1 defending against it. And rook a8, rook to a1. Right? But this is definitely a move you should always look at. Bishop b3, just going after these. That's the power of having the pawn close to queening. Okay. Anyway, rook d1, g4. Here's just one other variation to give you a sense of. That was to keep the black rook from going to g2 partly. You see the power of this pawn. Yeah, I have another variation where black takes, but then black's actually able to stop this pawn in time. So black doesn't have time to sack the rook on a2. He goes to queen right away. Check. Take this, queen. And I guess I could have also played rook f1 check. What? I messed up my variation. Let's go king e3. Rook takes. Queen. And now move the rook somewhere. The point is that at the end, white can't stop this from queening, and they can't perpetual check this king. Okay? So that gives you a sense of why a4, a3 was played, hopefully, which is what I wanted to do with that variation for you. Was make you understand why this was actually counterplay, why Anand spent 3 moves going a5, a4, a3. The issue is that when Carlsen chooses to break through on the king side, there could be a counterattack against a2, and this pawn could queen much faster than a pawn that Carlsen's been keeping on g2 to keep it safe, even though he might be up 2 pawns or more. So that's why he didn't go for it. And one of the reasons I found knight takes e5 at all was because when he played a4, I was like, why didn't Carlsen play a3? That's like an automatic move, right? Like doesn't he know that when the pawn gets to a3, that's quite a serious counterplay and quite annoying? Like, don't you want to limit it by going a3? But then I realized the timing works like they just realized knight e5, and if he plays a3, then black has knight e5, right? So unfortunately for him, he had to play king e2 now, and Anand got the pawn to a3. So all the way here, we have a lot of counterplay for black against the a2 pawn. Okay, so that's not what he played. He plays king e1, rook d7, bishop c1 attacking the a pawn, rook to a8. So still, rook takes h6. There's knight takes e5. And now finally he goes for this trade. And this bishop here gives black counterplay, so that's why instead of taking on g6, you always check first, make him retreat it, then take. So now he finally goes for it. He wins the pawn as expected, and now Anand's got to get his counterplay. And again, his counterplay is to go after a2, no matter how slow or fast that is. That's what he's got to go for. And Carlsen's plan now, since this pawn is so close to queening, Carlsen's plan actually, it's not that easy. Like, he needs to sort of like break through all of black's pawns and open up the position to deal with this. So bishop to b3 wasn't played here, but let's take a quick look at that. Let's say I take it here and play here to try and trade my bishop for that pawn. This king seems to be covering the rook's entry points, and it looks like white wins here, I think. On this move, I mean, he could maybe play rook d6 to keep his bishop, but another option would be to just do this thing I was talking about, right? Opening up the position so he can deal with the pawn. And maybe he can win this position here now that his rooks are controlling that a little bit. So that might be another option. And the other option is to go here, keeping his bishop, right? So now it's not quick for black to get any counterplay against this. And for the moment, he's up a pawn, so up a bishop. So I'm sure he's got some way to win that one. So he doesn't go for bishop b3. He goes rook d1. So Carlsen eliminates the most dangerous pawn here at the cost of basically trapping his bishop. All right. And so here, Anand resigned because if his king goes here, it blocks the counterattack on that, right? And white can take. And on rook a2, bishop c5, for example, is pretty easy. Okay, Jorik, I'll get to that in 1 second, I guess. Yeah, after we go over why he resigned here. And if the king comes back instead, then basically white's got back rank mating issues for black to deal with, which are just insoluble, right? So king e3, right? So instead of playing bishop c2, the last thing that Anand could have tried would have been rook takes a2. This wasn't played in the game, but I was thinking it might be possible. Maybe he didn't do it simply because of Carlsen keeping his bishop and bringing it here, right? And he can basically, the most he can get out of it is getting rid of the g pawn. But if you look at this situation, white still has 2 connected pass pawns extra, and his rooks are now super active, and black's in danger of losing all these pawns. And or getting his king checkmated if he does something like rook to a6 to try and defend them, right? Then, oops. So this is probably winning for Carlsen. I also wondered about playing this check anyway, and then sacking the bishop and checking here and playing this position, right? With like 5 pawns against the bishop. Or g4 here. I don't know. Rook c7 threatens mate, so he can't take on g2. He has to play his bishop somewhere. So I don't know. You could get something like check here, g4, right? 5 pawns versus a bishop. Maybe that's winning for Carlsen. Maybe rook b6 is a good move. But the other option is just to, whoops. The other option is just to keep the piece, and then rook h6 should be a win for white. So, oops, sorry, I went back kind of fast. So what we see is like eventually when Carlsen's going to break through and start winning pawns over here, it's going to allow a fair amount of counterplay based on these two pawns. And those variations were actually kind of tricky. I mean, if these weren't world champions playing, if they were, you and me, then you would expect there's like a fair chance of some kind of like a blunder and a swindle for black to save the game based on the power of the A3 pawn. So that was a very, very nice idea that Anand came up with that you guys can definitely use in bad positions to give yourselves some saving chances. But overall, the tide of the game was definitely very much against Anand, right? I mean, that endgame was always going to be super, super hard to try and get half a point out of. And Carlsen overall seems to have played it fairly well, right? I mean, at least strategically, he really laid out how you play this position, right? Just putting pressure on the opponent, creating a weakness, blockading the weakness, being patient, stopping their counterplays as much as possible, and patiently calculating every move if it's time to try and win the pawns yet or not. Okay. That said, there's one last question of interest here, which is, hey, what if black, instead of retreating bishop c6, which does let Carlsen win here, what if black instead just sacked the exchange with either king a7 or king to b8? It should be about the same. Let's do this one. And someone says it's a computer suggestion. Well, if it's a computer suggestion, it's certainly correct. I have not analyzed this, so I don't have anything like, I don't have any like long detailed computer variation to share with you about how white could win this. I do think that a lot of the times, I'll say in general, a lot of the times when you're in a very bad suffering position, you're better off losing an exchange than losing a pawn in terms of drawing chances. It's just a lot trickier for someone to convert an exchange often than like an extra pawn. The plans are just so simple, right? Like in the kind of position that we get in the game, right? The plan is just so simple for white to take all these pawns and advance these pawns, right? Versus in this position, it would not be so simple. I guess one thing is he might not even take if he doesn't want to. He could still go for winning the pawns, and he's just made the king go to a worse square where it blocks this rook. And the reason I had the king go to a7, I don't know if this is right again, but I was thinking that if king here, then maybe white can play this, and you can't play knight e5 because of rook check. So I was thinking maybe white could just take the pawn and delay whether he's taking any of these pieces here. But I don't know, maybe rook d1 is still enough counterplay. I was thinking to, I was also maybe thinking that in some case, I really don't know what's going on here, but then in some case I could play like a rook takes g6, rook a8 idea, right? So let's see, here, check, here, takes, there. Yeah, it worked, right? So anyway, because of those tactics, just to try and avoid them, I played king a7 for now, which blocks the rook here. So even now, bishop g6 is improved versus just playing bishop g6 without the check. So let's see how good or bad it is, right? Let's say we go for this. Black plays rook d1. We play here. Black goes here. I mean, he still got his rook down one move faster because his bishop was here. So there is that. On the other hand, I mean, we can still question whether black has enough counterplay here. Let's see. Definitely some counterplay, right? Having trouble with this piece. So again, we could try sacrificing it. Check here, here, here. Bishop d7 loses the bishop to rook g7 and rook h7. That's why I played this move order. But I don't know, maybe black has some chances still to save this one. Yeah, definitely. So alternatively, white could go for actually taking the exchange here, and I don't know, try and get these pieces out. There's definitely counterplay for black, yeah. So, yeah, I would guess that here this is a better defense for Anand, better than the bishop c6. I think it would be harder for Carlsen to try and convert this position if he played the move king a7, and it should be an interesting or illuminating position to analyze a little bit and try and learn how to play it if you're interested in, you know, end games with an extra exchange or end games with counterplay. If you want to see a little bit more about how this a3 pawn is so strong for black, you see that if the pawn were on a4 and white's pawn were on a3, black would have none of this, right? You guys all see that? So actually, the blunder on move 26, the only person that it benefited was Anand. Right? If Carlsen didn't play king d2 and then suddenly notice knight e5 and not be able to prevent a3, if he played the move I would suggest, like, oops, sorry, let's go back. If he played the move f3, like I would suggest, just defending this and then bringing his king over, then when Anand plays a4, he can play a3, and there's much less counterplay against this one than against the one that he had in the game. And Anand would have like no chance in this endgame, I think. So yeah, I mean the pawn on a3 provided a ton of counterplay. That's hopefully one of the nice lessons that we can all take from this is how in such a passive position, right, with those rooks stuck on d8 and g8 with his pawns like undefendable, right? That you could find this much counterplay and pose this many problems for your opponent by rushing that a pawn down to a3 is a very, very useful and interesting lesson. All right, so I'm going to end our analysis there for now. On the main line here, and this is where Anand resigned. And, oops, turn that off and sign off for the day. So a super interesting game, kind of a winnower style white positional attack on the king side, as I understand it, or that's the opening from which I learned some of these ideas. And really classic Carlsen again, right? Just kind of like a grueling endgame with lots of pieces and lots of tension, but no queens. And really hard to say where Anand got into such big difficulties, right? I think for a lot of people, it wouldn't be clear, and including me. And sort of my guess is the decision to trade off his bishop pair on c3, since you saw he never really had serious counterplay against those pawns till Carlsen allowed the pawn to a3, and that was kind of like a weird thing. But the doubled pawns I don't think paid off compared to the bishop pair. And then maybe king c7 is the wrong direction for the king to go, and maybe it should be on e7. I don't know. And then, you know, king e7, f6 or something like that. But certainly something which people will be discussing for a long time to try and understand. All right. Hope you all enjoyed it. And tomorrow should be a rest day. And then the day after, Carlsen has white again. So we're going to see 2 games in a row with Carlsen as white. And I think Anand should just keep preparing the Sicilian. Even though this game went badly, it was just one variation, this one queen d3 thing. Maybe knight c6 is the wrong decision against queen d3, just based on who these players are. And Anand needs to just keep looking in the Sicilian for some good variations for himself. All right, that's my takeaway from this. And if you have any questions, leave them for me in the comments. And have a great day.